Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is August 21st, 2009, and my guest is Michael Munger of Duke University. Mike, it is always a pleasure to have you on the program.
It's great to be back.
Our topic for today is culture, and by culture, I don't mean Puccini and Picasso, but rather the way that people interact on a daily basis in our ongoing lives with each other, our expectations, assumptions about how others will behave. You and I came up with this topic after your recent stay in Europe. Tell our listeners what you were doing there.
Well, I was teaching at Friedrich Alexander University. I was teaching 2 graduate classes, and it's in Germany, in Erlangen, Germany, just north of Nuremberg. I don't speak any German. That's not normally a problem because I live in the U.S., but living in Germany for 4 months, I was often reminded of the importance not just of speaking German, but of understanding kind of meanings and expectations, which were sometimes subtly and sometimes substantially different, and I often embarrassed myself.
And these are, when business people travel, they're told about how people shake hands, whether they bow, what kind of small talk, hand gestures, etc., are going to be expected or the norm. My brother recently was in Japan, and he was in his hotel. He checked into his hotel, and he asked somebody, maybe the concierge, if he should tip the person who took his bag for him up to his room, and there was a look of horror in response because in Japan tipping is not done.
Yeah, it's an insult.
Whereas in America, if you don't tip, you might get your bag
an even worse insult.
Yeah, much worse. Right, that's a mistake you want to make in one direction if you're going to make it. But those kind of things we understand. Those kind of differences are kind of relatively transparent. Those are the things we ask about. But you encountered some subtler cues and behavior. So tell us about some of those things you noticed.
Well, one of the things that you learn when you go somewhere else like that is there's the sort of interactions that you mentioned about businessmen. George Bernard Shaw is reputed to have said that manners is the art of offending no one unintentionally. So if you wanted to offend someone, it had to be on purpose.
Yeah.
So if you have bad manners, though, you've offended someone without meaning to, and maybe without even knowing it.
Right.
So very first, I was teaching, as I said, 2 graduate classes, and there's an ancient tradition in most of Europe, but certainly in Germany, called the academic quarter. And the presumption was that academics were so confused that they were not likely to be able to find their classrooms until at least 15 minutes after the supposed start time. So I had a class that was supposed to start at 6 p.m., and I got there, as is my wont, because I have a fetish about timeliness. I got there at 5 till 6.
Uh-huh.
And 2 minutes after 6, 5 minutes after 6, there's nobody there. Somebody shows up, and then a few people were there by 10 after 6. So I thought, well, okay. And then I started class, and a few more people came in, and I said, I really consider it rude if you come late. And people nodded. They accepted that. And they're Germans, after all. So I was expecting a certain timeliness,
It's a legendary stereotype. I don't know if it's true.
Sure. Well, it may be a stereotype, but that was a cultural expectation that I had, was that people would be on time. And here it was just flagrantly wrong. So the second class, the same thing happened, even after I had done my little jerk act and said, I expect you to come on time. And so I said, maybe you have a class beforehand. Maybe you have a train or something that you have to make. Let's start at 6:10 instead of 6, because I understand. So a kid raises his hand and says, so you mean 6:25? And I said, well, this is a kid that I had talked to a couple times outside of class, and I thought, what a jerk. No, I don't mean 6:25. I would have said 6:25 if I had meant 6:25. But finally it was explained to me that you simply add 15 minutes to whatever the written down start time is, and everyone understands that. Well, everyone but me understands that, and so there isn't a problem so long as people's expectations are consistent. So the meaning of 6 o'clock is actually 6:15, and everyone knows that without having to say. And so finally, I started starting at 6:15, and it was all fine.
So this is the opposite, by the way, of Vince Lombardi time. Lombardi time was if the meeting was called for 6, you showed up at 5:45.
Yeah.
And if you came at 5:50, you were late.
Yeah. Because it's disrespectful.
Yeah. So just before we get into some of the wider things that happened to you in Germany, I assume you taught the class in English.
I did, and I was part of the reason they wanted me to do it. It was funded by the DAAD. It was to give them more exposure to English language and American culture. So I was there as an avatar of American culture, but
I restrained myself from making a whole wide variety of observations about you as exemplar.
I do appreciate that.
Yeah. One other question about that class. Did you notice, in classes generally, did you notice a different behavior by your students relative to American students? Because there's a certain, my impression is that European students behave differently, have different expectations about their classroom demeanor, et cetera.
Well, they were outraged that I assigned readings because you're not supposed to assign readings. They basically read on their own and work on papers. And the fact that I expected them to have read, and I quickly got away from this, but I expected them to have read before class. That's not the way it works. And they tried to explain that you can give readings if you want, but you can't possibly expect them to read it. And you can't really expect them to talk. This is a lecture. They show up, they listen, they write it down, and then they go home.
Yeah, that's what I've heard, is that there's less, quote, participation.
It's not just quantitatively less. It's qualitatively less. It's nothing.
Uh-huh. Interesting. Was that hard to adjust to? Because I know you don't like to talk.
I am reminded by Doug North when he got the Nobel Prize. Bob Fogel was going before him. Fogel and Doug North both got the Nobel Prize in economics, and Fogel was answering a question and said, I could talk about this for hours. And Doug North jumped in and said, and if nobody stops him, he will. So yes, if no one stops me, I'm happy to talk for hours. Yeah, I didn't mind it too much.
That's why we're in the fields we're in.
Yeah.
So in before we go on again, sorry to interrupt. There's this legendary story. I may have even talked about it on EconTalk before, and you and I may have talked about it before. It involves, I think it's Pigou and Marshall. You know this story?
I don't think I do.
I hope I'm getting the ages right. I think Pigou was Marshall's student, or is it the other way around?
That's the right order,
okay,
yeah.
So Pigou signs up for a class with Marshall. We're talking about Alfred Marshall and A.C. Pigou. And it turns out there's one student in the class. It's Pigou. And Marshall comes into class, goes to the front of the room, opens his notes, and proceeds to lecture to the one student who takes notes diligently, as you've just described. I think that's a true story. If any listeners out there can verify that or have a source for it, we'd appreciate it. So classroom demeanor is different, but out in the world, and I don't know if you want to reveal this, Mike, but I've seen the bicycle you drove around on your website. Mike, we can put a link up to that if you're interested, if you're willing.
Yeah.
But you were out as an American in a slightly different and sometimes radically different world. What were some of the experiences you had interacting, shopping, and doing other things?
Well, it really did make me think about the way that expectation shapes so much of what we consider to be rude. Now, those of you the listeners who have been maybe to Japan or somewhere else, one of the first things you notice is that if you come up to a stoplight as a pedestrian, and if you look both ways, and then cross against the light, even if there's no cars coming, the other people will yell at you. My sister lived in Kyoto, Japan. I think we've talked about this, and she crossed against the light once, and this little grandmother came out with an umbrella and tried to hit her because she was violating the social order. And it didn't matter that there's no cars coming. The light's red. You're not supposed to go. In the U.S., you can get a ticket. I actually got a ticket in Washington, D.C. once for jaywalking, but it would be pretty rare.
It's pretty rare. I don't think New York would be my favorite place for this.
The taxis actually they enforce this because they'll hit you.
They'll hit you. They'll try. I mean, it's
they'll come close.
Catch as catch can.
Yeah.
Well,
Erlangen, the city I was living in, which is 20 kilometers northwest of Nuremberg.
And what's the rough population?
60,000. It's a small medieval town. Most of that's the university. It also has a big Siemens research facility. So it's pretty eggheadish. I believe it has, I'm not sure if this is true, but I believe it has the highest concentration of bicycles per automobile in all of Germany. And if not, it's in the top 3. So almost all of the traffic is bicycles. And interestingly, I'm from the South and from the U.S. If I see someone crossing or someone trying to get in on a bicycle, I'm going to try to let them in. I caused at least 3 pretty significant bicycle accidents by trying to let someone in. Now, Russ, here's what you do.
While you were on your bike?
I was riding my bike, and I just would slow down a little bit to let in a pedestrian in a place where there was no other reason to slow down, and either I was hit or the person behind me had to stop and was themselves hit. So there's no question I caused this. What do you do? Let me ask you. Let me ask the listeners also. Form in your mind the answer to this question. What do you do if a pedestrian is crossing and it's pretty crowded and you're riding a bicycle? The answer is aim at them. Ride directly towards them under the assumption that they will continue to walk. Now, there's 2 possible problems with this. If they're an American, they might stop and you'll hit them.
Right.
Or if it's an American riding his bicycle, he might stop and the person behind will hit. But if they're all Germans, you have a German pedestrian and a German bicyclist. The German bicyclist knows ride directly towards the pedestrian as fast as you can. The pedestrian's going to take 2 more steps in the intervening time, and you'll go just behind them.
And how'd you find that out?
Watching. After I caused a pretty significant bike accident one day, and my legs were sore. So I was sitting on a bench, and I thought, I'm going to figure this out. And it literally, and I asked people, and they said, of course. In fact, some of them, it took a second for them to understand my question because it was so obvious.
So natural. They never
thought about it. Of course you do that.
Yeah.
When, to be fair, it makes perfect sense. The fact is, I was the one being rude. I was causing an accident by doing what I thought was polite.
Yeah, let me give you 2 other road examples that I find challenging in America. Where it's one of them is straightforward, the other one less so. I've just come back from California, and in California, particularly in the Bay Area, and particularly on the campus of Stanford, you stop for a pedestrian in the middle of the block, even.
Yeah.
And as a pedestrian, there you come to be pretty aggressive. Pedestrians act like New Yorkers, as do the bicyclists, and the car drivers act extremely passively.
Yeah.
A 4-way stop can lead, at Stanford, can lead to a standoff.
An equilibrium.
Yeah, it's a little frightening. Everyone's looking, and then finally somebody waves, the other person waves. In New York, it's hey, I was there a millisecond before you. I'm on the right. I'm going. So it's interesting to think about coming back as a pedestrian from Stanford to a more aggressive place.
You might get hit.
It's dangerous. And similarly, a visitor there as a driver is dangerous because they're not used to those expectations.
No way you'd expect that.
But it's very clear you learn very quickly what they are in that place. Now, I'm going to give you another example where the expectations are not clear. The lights, when I first moved to D.C., there was an enormous thunderstorm, and the power went out in a large part of Montgomery County where I live, and a lot of the stoplights were out.
Yeah.
What is one's expectation about a stoplight? I think in general, a stoplight, if you're on the busy street and the cross street's relatively quiet, some people's, I won't say most because I have no idea, but some people's expectation is you pretend it's green if you're on the busy street, and you pretend it's red on the less busy street.
Or as if there's no light and there's a stop sign.
A stop sign, exactly. And so as a driver on the busy street, I found that extremely unnerving, and I would slow down and almost get hit sometimes by the people behind me who didn't expect me to slow down. And I'm coming into an intersection where there's a light that's not working.
Right.
To me, it was obvious that you should slow down or stop even, treat it like a four-way stop.
Yeah.
They wanted to treat it like a one-way stop, only for the small cross street. It's not clear what you do there.
Right, and it's like any coordination game. The problem comes from the mix of expectations. Any consistent set of expectations would work, although it would have distributional consequences.
Right.
The problem for the accidents is when you have a mix.
And of course, I think we've talked about, or at least I've blogged on Cafe Hayek, there are intersections, particularly in Asia, where people go at full speed, kind of akin to your bike. We'll try to put some of these videos up on links to this conversation. But there are intersections where people go, they don't hesitate.
Yeah.
They drive at full speed at a four-way stop without a stop light or stop sign.
Yeah.
And everybody's racing through, and then all of a sudden the other side gets the edge, and they're all racing through.
Yeah.
And it's an unbelievable.
But it sort of works out. You on Cafe Hayek, you linked to the video that I took from atop the Arc de Triomphe.
Right.
And
similar phenomenon. Describe that.
Well, what happened was there are no lanes. It's really surprising to see this big, heavily congested circle with no lanes. But you watch the way people drive, and you can see why there are no lanes, because they basically figure it out. And what would happen is just what you just said. People on the outside are going to go around the circle. People on the inside want to get off the circle. And one or the other ends up stopping, and the momentum means that, let's suppose that there's a bunch of people on the inside of the circle who want to leave the circle and go straight. There's no way for the circle continuers to break in. But then there is a break, and the circle continuers start to go, and the ones who want to get off have to wait. But they manage to figure it out without any lanes, without any signals. Now, I'm sure there's some accidents and shaken. It's France, after all.
Yeah.
So there may be some words exchanged, and the Parisian emergency brake is the horn. But still, they manage to work it out.
Yeah, it's an example of emergent order without rules, where the rules emerge spontaneously.
I would hate to drive it, though, because I'm not used to driving in that setting.
Right. It'd be very alarming. It's a place I'd like to teach my daughter how to drive. I think that would be the ideal.
Yeah, that would be terrific. Give her a stick shift and put her in the circle around the Arc de Triomphe.
Yeah, I have enough trouble on a quiet suburban street. As my brother calls it, it's white knuckle time.
Yeah.
Let's move away from traffic, which is an example where decisions are being made very spontaneously, often in real time. There's human life at stake. To this an issue of civility and versus rudeness. Talk about what happened to you at the it was a grocery, I think.
Yeah, I'm not a big expert on civility, as those of you who know me know. Nonetheless, I would prefer not to offend people unintentionally. In the United States, if you see an elderly woman coming up with a shopping cart, and you're thinking you're going to use a shopping cart, when you go in, you might say, I'll take that the rest of the way for you and save her the trip, and go ahead and take the shopping cart in. Now, those of you who have been to Europe are probably laughing at me already, because many places, in order to get a shopping cart, you have to pay, in effect, a deposit of €1. And the way that it works, €1 is something like a $1.40, but it's a coin. You put the coin into a slot in the grocery cart, and then it unchains, and then when you finish with the grocery cart, you put it back in, slip the little chain back into the slot, and the euro pops out. And it makes sense. It's not that you're buying the shopping cart, it's just a deposit. Shopping carts obviously worth a lot more than that. But it's a way to make sure people return them.
Yeah, they have a tendency to wander. It's interesting. Well, at the end, we'll come back and talk about the United States and what's a little bit different. But that's the custom there. That's the procedure.
Yeah, I mean, in the U.S., it's true that you see shopping carts all over the place. And in Europe, as a result, you see the shopping carts are all tightly chained up there right up by the store. So I can see the reason for it. I didn't know this. I just didn't know. And I've been to a lot of grocery stores, and the problem was the apparent familiarity of the situation, because I thought, look, I've walked past churches, I've walked into restaurants and tried to order things, and I've got them wrong, but this is a grocery store. I know how to act at a grocery store. So I see an elderly woman coming up with her shopping cart, and I don't speak German, but I pantomime, I'll take that for you, ma'am. And her eyes kind of open wide. And I have to give her credit. She was pretty quick. She's an old lady wearing old lady shoes, and was pushing a heavy shopping cart. But still, she faked left and then went right. But I was too quick for her.
Yeah.
Let's be honest. I was too quick for her. And I grabbed the cart, and I was going to take it. And she starts yelling, screaming, actually, which surprised me because I didn't know what I had done. And then I see a policeman running towards us, and he really wasn't running towards us. He was running towards me.
Yeah.
And when you see a policeman running and he's looking at you, it makes your heart beat fast, especially when you don't know what in the world's gone on.
Yeah.
So she's yelling in German. He's yelling in German at me, and I say something I said 30 or 40 times a day: I'm sorry, I don't speak German. Fortunately, he was ex-military, ex-German military, and had lived near, it turns out, a U.S. military base. And still pretty angrily and right in my face said, "What are you doing?" And I tried to explain, and I could see the corners of his mouth starting to turn up. He's trying not to laugh because I'm really scared. The old lady's really upset, and the whole situation's kind of absurd. But he checks. He asked for my ID, and I don't carry my passport just routinely there in town. But I had my Duke ID and my driver's license, and I showed him. And he mentioned that his nephew had gone to Duke to business school to the executive program. So he and I are kind of relaxing. And he said, "I understand. Okay, I see what happened." But then he again, almost smiling, says, "She's still looking, isn't she?" And I looked around him, and the old lady is peeking out from behind a concrete pylon. And she clearly wants justice to be done.
Sure.
So I nod. I say, "Yeah, she's still looking." And then he starts yelling and poking his finger into the middle of my chest. And I'm not going to yell, but imagine that I'm yelling now. And he says, "You have to understand, she doesn't speak English. And if you just nod a couple of times, our business here today will be finished." I considered that to be excellent police work.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive.
I mean, I'm abashed. I'm nodding. He walks back towards his car, and the old lady nods her head and gets into her car because justice had been done. It was okay with her that I hadn't been arrested, but if you're going to try to steal €1 from an old lady, some sort of punishment must be meted out.
Yep. So, but she got her euro.
She had by that time taken her cart back and gotten her euro, yes.
And you learned a lesson.
From that point on, I always made sure I had a euro in my pocket. Actually, for the next week or so, I just carried stuff on my arms because I was too psychologically damaged.
Yeah. You may never be the same around objects with 4 small wheels.
Just the thought of carts. If I even hear one, it frightens me, especially if it has a wobbly wheel.
Now that's an example where it's, once you learned what had happened, it was no big deal. You didn't do it again, presumably, or you look for an older woman the next time, so that you can even more sure to get her euro.
She was too loud.
Yeah, right. You need a more feeble and quieter one who can't reach the cops. But what I find interesting in these kind of situations is the gray areas. I can't think of any right off the top of my head. They may come to me in a minute, but areas where there's some nuance. There really wasn't much nuance. You knew now not to do that again. You knew what the order of things was. But it's just interesting in real life, the subtlety often of signals and...
Well, you've already mentioned an example, really, and it's tipping. People basically don't tip in Germany. The way that you would normally tip is to... if you pay something, you would go up to the next euro because for some reason they consider it to be very annoying to have to make change. Now, what I almost always did was they would give me the bill. I would give them suppose it's 17.50 euro. I'd give them a 20 euro bill, wait for them to make change, and then hand them back 2 euro as a tip because that's what I would normally do in the U.S. I did this for months. And I noticed that they always were angry. But even though a 2 euro tip is a pretty big tip, normally you would give at most 10%, probably more like 3%. Any tip at all is going to make them happy because it's just not a tipping culture, nor is it a service culture. I've heard people call it a service wasteland.
Curious how that works.
Right, it's a different equilibrium. But so here I was giving an almost American-sized tip, and they were angry, and the gray area was it's just demeaning to have to make change. Why would that be? It doesn't take that long. But no one, then the answer is, and it was explained to me several times, no one does it. Why would you make someone? It's like you're standing there watching while you threw it on the floor. The analogy that was made to me was, suppose you had thrown it on the floor and you wanted the person to pick it up. Obviously, that would be demeaning.
Right.
That was how they viewed having to make change.
It's interesting.
And there's no way I would have expected that, and it was a much more gray area because I didn't immediately figure it out.
Well, let me give another example that it's not the gray area I'm thinking about, but it's getting that direction. If you're in line, maybe we talked about this in our gouging podcast. I don't think so, but if you're in line at the grocery and someone, here's where the gray area comes in an airplane when you're waiting to board, and they call Group 2. When they call Group 2 at the airport, there's a certain dance that emerges at the gate where you don't really line up. Sometimes you do. Sometimes you literally line up. And
well, if you're in Group 2, you do. But suppose you're in Group 3.
But even Group 2ers with Southwest, they cattle car you up. You actually literally line up. But at a lot of airlines, people are kind of. Sometimes it's the Group 3ers waiting for the Group 2 to finish. There's sort of a semicircle that forms around the gate, and people like me who have a neurosis about whether their bag's going to fit into the overhead rack, whether there's going to be space for it, are kind of nearer to the front. But if people have already stood up and formed that semicircle, and now you get up, it's sort of not okay to get toward the front of it, even though there's no line. Yep. You're sort of, to me, again, maybe people feel differently.
You would have to elbow your way through them.
Sometimes, or just kind of, you could be right behind someone near the front and surge forward, but it's kind of bad form.
Yeah. Even though you're all getting on the same airplane.
It's bizarre how we're racing to get on so we can sit and do nothing.
Well, but it is true that the overhead fills.
That's, I think, part of the reason.
And this is going to happen more and more as airlines start charging for checked bags.
Yeah, puzzle to me is why airlines don't develop planes with larger carry-on space, since it is, but maybe it's just my neurosis. Maybe other people don't. You probably have it, right? This neurosis?
I always check bags. My neurosis for this is so severe that I check bags to avoid the anxiety that you're describing.
Oh, but Mike, if you check your bag, you have the anxiety they're going to lose your bag.
You
don't have that one.
I would pay somebody to take all of my clothing.
Really? Wow. Gosh. Okay. I say I've got all my valuable stuff in my computer bag. It weighs about 40 pounds, or maybe 60. So I have like shoulder problems, neck problems. Yeah. It's a bad situation. But with an airline, to me, the only obviously bad form, and this drives me nuts, and it happens though, is when they call Group 2 and a Group 3er cheats. Yeah. And usually the person checking the boarding passes just waves them through. Yeah. And sometimes they say, "Oh no, you're in the wrong group." Yeah. And the person's kind of embarrassed because they're cheating. They have to kind of pretend, "Oh yeah, I wasn't really paying attention." Right. I take my bag space.
To cheat about something so petty
doesn't matter.
Is what's embarrassing. If they were trying to steal $1,000, okay, I'm not embarrassed. You caught me. But
the other example I was going to give is at a grocery store. You're waiting in line. It's against the rules to cut in line, to literally to shove your cart and elbow your way in to the front of the line. It would also be considered unbelievably gauche to act like an economist and say to the group of, say, 4 people who are there ahead of you, "Folks, I'm kind of in a little bit of a hurry. I wonder if I could give each of you $2. Yeah. And can I cut in front?"
Yeah, would you mind? Well, and what some people might try is just find one person, say, "I'll give you $10."
Yeah, and let me
I'll
slip
not compensate the other ones that I'm cutting in front of.
But let's say I did it for all of them, and I think
even if you did it for all of them,
the standard answer that we sort of have in economics for why that doesn't happen is transaction costs. It's somebody might say, "Well, I'll do it for 4," and then there's a discussion, and that's obviously costly. But it's more than that. There's a cultural taboo to bribe people or to compensate people for cutting in line. You'd be much more likely to succeed if you said, "I'm really my kids are in the car. I'm really in a hurry." Yeah. Would it be okay if
it would have to be voluntary? I have let people in under those circumstances.
All the time. You do it in a second. And of course, there's a risk some people will lie, and you don't verify it. Nobody cares. And yet, Julian Simon created a way for people. We'll just let that go. Can we let that go?
Please.
Okay. So Julian Simon invented a way suggested a way for airlines to let people cut in line. When there was not enough spaces on the plane, the airlines do this little mini auction on the spot with transaction costs, but somehow it works out remarkably well where they say, we don't have enough spaces on the plane. Who's willing for, a free round-trip ticket to go on a later flight?
Yeah.
Sometimes there's a mad rush as people compete. Sometimes nobody raises their hand, so they'll say 2 round-trip tickets. Yeah. It's a very effective way to solve the problem.
It's an auction.
Yeah, that you can't anticipate the exact schedule of who's going to show up, and so they overbook on purpose, and every once in a while it doesn't work out, and they solve it very beautifully. So I find it fascinating that that's the culture. Sometimes it's okay to use prices of money once it's institutionalized and formal like that. If you tried to innovate it on your own, you'd get raised eyebrows and people would pretend you weren't talking if you started to try to bribe them to cut in line.
Yeah, they would be embarrassed for you, and certainly they would be embarrassed for themselves. And so, I think they would probably pretend not even to have heard you.
You'd look down.
Well, why is this? I think one of the things I think is interesting about culture is that it seems like it's kind of hardwired. And let me give an example that it actually happened to me in the United States, but I think most people are going to identify with. We have a physiological response to seeing someone else breaking the rules. And as a result, we're more likely to provide the public good of norm enforcement. Now, a lot of times, violation of norms actually doesn't harm us very much. So like the little old lady that came out with the umbrella in Japan, it didn't make any sense for her except that she was providing the public good. It is externalities if we all try to provide the enforcement of norms. And so we have an emotional response. There's a lot of work in philosophy and behavioral economics that treat the emotional and physiological response that we have to seeing someone violate a cultural norm as being a biological and evolved way of solving the collective action problem, because rather than just saying, oh boy, he's breaking the rules, that's a shame, we get angry. Now, the problem is that in some cases it's completely inappropriate. Men particularly, if they're driving and there's a lot of traffic and somebody cuts them off, they think, I'm going to teach him a lesson.
Right.
Well, it's not rational.
To take on the costs of that. The benefits are shared by thousands of people.
If there are any benefits at all, yeah.
The benefits to you are trivial. You're bearing all the costs. Why would you go chase a guy down and scream in his face?
Yeah, so I was in Washington, D.C. I used to live in D.C., and I was waiting in line for a movie, and it was a pretty long wait. It was a while before it was going to open. I'd been there about 15 minutes. It was probably about 10 more minutes before I would get to the front of the line and get to go into my movie. And I was talking to the person behind me, and I turned around, and in front of me was about a 5-foot-tall, 100-pound woman. And she had not been there before. I'd been standing there for quite a while, and she hadn't been there before. I said, you can't butt in line. Now, she looked up at me.
You're taller than 5 feet.
The listeners might not know, I'm about 6'1", 250 pounds. And she looked up at me and said, if you say one more word, I'm going to call the police. I was so angry. I was so upset at this. I barely remember seeing the movie, and I didn't sleep. Now, what was it that she had actually cost me? And the answer is like 20 seconds.
Yeah, not even that.
You get to the front of the line, there's 3 different windows open. And so at most, she cost me 20 seconds. This had nothing to do with any rational response. It was that clearly what she had done was walked along until she found a large man who wasn't looking and just nipped in there.
Yeah.
And I bet she'd done it before. And it benefited her. Why don't we see more of that sort of sociopathic behavior? How is it that societies defend themselves against this? And the answer is we respond irrationally to seeing violations of cultural norms by providing more norm enforcement than we should. It shouldn't. I should have laughed, but I didn't. In fact, thinking about it now, it still upsets me.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think my stomach's churning just at the thought of it.
How dare you? Yeah. I mean, think how you would react, because I was completely undone. And frankly, if it had been a guy, we might have had a fight, and I'm not proud of that either. That's stupid.
Yeah, that's really extraordinary. In fact, the right experiment would be if she had said to you, could you help me with this? And you'd said to the person behind you, I'll be right back. And you'd gone and helped her with some task. She needed 4 hands instead she only had 2. And it took you 20 seconds and you came back. You wouldn't say, gosh, the nerve of her dragging me out of line for 20 seconds. Right? You would have said, or when you were near the front, you just would have said, "Oh, I did a good deed." Even
I would have felt better.
You did a good deed. Here, you let this person who was obviously extremely anxious about seeing the movie, someone like myself, you shortened the line for her.
Yeah.
But it is there's a visceral reaction in those settings.
We can't control it, and that's actually why it is an adaptive sort of group response. And the interesting thing, I guess the theory that I would advance for this is there's two components to this. There's the contents of a black box, and that's the set of culturally determined norms that they're inherited. Let me come back to that in a second. They are inherited because we didn't decide on them. We learned them. And if you're in a different culture, I believe in lines because I was raised in a culture that has lines. If I'd been raised in China, there's not the norm of lines. People just crush in.
Really?
And so,
have you been to China?
I have not, but John Aldrich, one of my colleagues here at Duke, said he found it very disconcerting if they're trying to go to a movie because people just press up and they're pressed right against you.
And the polite guy who hangs back ends up missing the movie. Yeah, exactly.
But it's not politeness. You're an idiot.
It's not. Right.
That's not the allocation mechanism.
Yeah, exactly.
So we have a sort of soft or conditioned idea about what the norms are, but then everybody, all humans basically, except for a few sociopaths, have this physiological response to seeing whatever the contents of that black box are broken. And so, there's an ancient example of this that's one of my favorites that I raise with students, partly because I want them to make sure that they know what the word shibboleth is. But there's an old story from the Hebrew Bible, Judges chapter 12. The word, I think in Hebrew, it's actually shibboleth.
Yeah, there's no th in Hebrew.
Yeah, so it's shibboleth, and the accent is different, but the English word is shibboleth.
Mm-hmm.
And a shibboleth is either an ear of corn or wheat, or a freshet, a stream. But its meaning doesn't really matter. What matters is the pronunciation. There were two different Hebrew tribes that had, I guess you'd call it a war. It was certainly a battle. The two tribes were the Ephraimites and the Gileadites. And the Gileadites had won, this is about 1200 BC, so 3,000 years ago, more than 3,000 years ago. The Gileadites had won, and the Ephraimites were trying to get back across the Jordan River to their home territory. And the Gileadites had set themselves up there were two large fords a couple of miles apart on the Jordan, and they were trying to find out if they could, if any of the Ephraimites were disguised as refugees trying to cross back into their territory. And so what Judges said, let me just quote it. Gilead then cut Ephraim off from the fords of the Jordan. And whenever Ephraimite fugitives said, "Let me cross," the men of Gilead would ask, "Are you an Ephraimite?" And they'd say, "No." They then said, "Very well, say ye shibboleth." And if anyone said shibboleth because they couldn't pronounce it, they would kill him. They slew there that day by the fords of the Jordan 42,000 Ephraimites. So imagine this long line of people. And you get up to the front, and you've got presumably thousands and thousands of Gileadites, because otherwise the 42,000 Ephraimites could have rushed them. So an army, you're trying to get through an army so you can get back to your home.
I like the sequence of the question. So it's trust but verify. Are you an Ephraimite? Okay.
Well, if they say yes, then they kill you for being an idiot.
Yeah, exactly.
If you can't pronounce shibboleth, then they kill you for being an Ephraimite. Well, here's the thing, and here's why it's inherited. Culture is inherited from the people who raise you. Culture is inherited from the people who raise you. It's not genetic. Suppose you had a pair of Ephraimite twins. One of them was raised as an Ephraimite, and the other was raised with the Gileadites. And this is the pre-exilic Hebrew had a number of dialects. And it actually, I looked at this a bit, did some research on it. There's some question about whether the story could be literally true, because unlike the TH sound, the SH sound is really important, apparently, in all the pre-exilic Hebrew dialects. So it's not clear exactly what they're getting at.
Not much of a test.
Well, but taking the story at face value.
Doesn't matter.
There are some languages that have the SH sound and others that don't.
Right.
All children, basically, unless you have some deformity of the tongue or palate, could pronounce the SH sound if they're exposed to it before about the age of 6 or 7. Your ability to acquire language is highly plastic. Children are just machines at picking up sounds and languages up until a certain pretty young age. So you separate Ephraimite twins. One of them is raised by the Ephraimites, cannot pronounce shibboleth. The other one, raised by the Gileadites, can. So there's nothing genetic about it. It just depends how you were raised. But then it becomes something very close to hardwired.
Right,
now, the shibboleth really was hardwired because presumably they're trying really hard to pronounce it.
Yeah, they're not. Yeah,
they're not faking.
Yeah,
but
that's very cool.
So it is interesting to think about the other things that are kind of hardwired for us that we take for granted. And being in this other culture made me think about that. It's sort of, there's a bunch of things that seem to me obviously right that I have no argument for being right, except that that's what I'm used to.
Yeah, it reminds me, as you called that person who cut in line a sociopath, which is usually a term we reserve for a slightly more heinous type of behavior. But what I think is worth mentioning is that line cutter was really a parody of what we might call Homo economicus, economic man, in this case, economic woman, who took advantage of, acted in her, quote, own self-interest.
Clearly
did not feel shame, very important.
No shame, no guilt.
No shame or guilt that you looked at her with horror and disgust because, in fact, she felt sorry for you, if anything, not for herself.
Yeah, what an idiot.
Yeah, the example, coming back to our tipping story, you don't tip a bank teller who gives you, when you cash a check for $100 and gives you $100 back, you don't say, here's $15 for you. They'd think you were a fool if you did that. But in a restaurant, if you don't do it, you're considered gauche. You're considered ill-mannered.
You're considered Homo economicus.
Right. And Homo economicus is, I think the behavioral economics critique of economics is sometimes overdone. I think everybody understands, every good economist understands that acting in your narrowest of self-interests is not always what people do. Rational economic man tips. Rational economic man gives blood. Rational economic man doesn't cut in line for all kinds of reasons, some of them being these social norms. But if you did not get raised with those norms, and Jennifer Roback Morse talks about this a little bit in her book, on love and the family. If you're not raised with those norms, you can become Homo economicus, and you're very unpleasant. You can be a very unpleasant person to be around. You don't get a lot of friends.
Without understanding why other people don't like you.
Yeah, because you don't conform to the norms of civility and behavior that are expected of you.
Well, let me try to see what you think of my thesis. Then, Homo economicus is a sociopath. It would be perceived as a sociopath if what you mean is I get away with everything that I can get away with. Now, you can say that it's a repeat game and I actually end up caring, but I think it's something more than that.
Well, I think the right point to make in the policy context is that I think in general people who do behave that way get short-run benefit and huge long-run costs. They have trouble finding business partners. They have trouble finding people to contract with because it's going to
be hard to get married.
Their costs are high. Exactly. The cost of dealing with such people is high. And really, P.T. Barnum, gets a bad rap as for his quotation, there's a sucker born every minute. He, again, we may have talked about this, but he is the person really who created the circus, not because he invented it, but because he created the honest circus. Before he came along, circuses would come to town, people would stand in crowds and watch the acts, and the owner of the circus would have pickpockets who would circulate among the crowd, and when the circus left town, the people would be poorer, not because of the admission fee, but because their thieves had taken their money. And Barnum said, we're not going to do that.
Yeah.
And he wrote a book about how to behave as a business person, suggesting that honest dealing was the road to profit.
To profits, yes.
Not to loss.
Yeah. If you can capture the reputation part of it.
Yeah.
But it is interesting the role that shame and guilt play, and we look at different cultures. Sometimes they're organized by shame, and sometimes they're organized by guilt. Guilt is, I have a sense that I will feel bad if I do something perceived as wrong. Shame is that other people will think I've done something wrong and I've brought it to my family. Mm-hmm. So in the Middle East, for example, it's much more of a shame-based culture than Northern Europe and the United States, which tend to be more guilt-based cultures. I mean, there's caricatures that Catholic and Jewish people tend to be much more guilt in the sense that they internalize this. But almost no society could work very well unless we self-monitored. And the reasons that we've given really are three. One is we care about our family, and we will demean the position and reputation of our family. But so if you're all by yourself, you don't care as much about that.
Right.
If you worry, though, for religious reasons or others, that I would feel terrible if I ever butted in line. Then I wouldn't be able to watch the movie because I think, what a jerk I am.
Yeah, how did I do that?
And the third thing is that just for economic reasons, reputation matters a lot for profitability and trust because everybody recognizes you can't specify all the future contingencies of contracts. The transactions cost of dealing with Homo economicus are really high. And so you have to rely on one-shot Homo economicus are really high. But in a repeat setting, many of these problems are solved by the incentives for cooperation and the fact that reputation internalizes what look like external costs.
Yeah, no, it's a very now we're getting finally to this point I was interested in before, this gray area of what's allowed and what isn't allowed. One of the more, I think, interesting cases where, at least in America, this comes up is in a rental contract. Let's say was just on vacation. We rented a place and we put down a deposit for half of the amount, and when we showed up, we gave the owner the other half. And this was the husband of the people who owned the place. Well, the wife, after we didn't meet for a couple days, reminded me when she met us, that actually we weren't supposed to just put down the rest of the rental, that she expected us to give her another check, which would be a deposit against damages. And that is a standard provision. It's a standard procedure. But she looked at me and said, don't worry about it. She made a decision, obviously foolish.
I would have had the opposite conclusion.
Yeah, you should have doubled it with well, she didn't see my kids. That was her big mistake. No, she looked at me either out of embarrassment, that face-to-face.
Yeah. Face-to-face, you're saying, I don't trust you, give me the money.
That bothered her, I think. And she also, by the way, forgot to ask for the cleaning fee, which I volunteered later the next day. Because I also think she felt kind of uncomfortable asking for the money outright, even though we'd already agreed to it. But I felt bad. I knew I'd feel bad if later I didn't pay for it, and even if she didn't ask. So I gave her the cleaning fee voluntarily on it in another check the next day.
Uh-huh.
But this idea of damages is so vague. There's no definition, right? Obviously, we damaged the place. We tracked in dirt.
Yeah.
We may have torn something. We may have scratched something.
Scratched the wall. You clearly scratched the wall.
Things happened. And with my kids, often really dramatic things happen.
Yeah.
In this case, nothing that I saw, although, again, even that is not reliable. They may have done something and not mentioned it to me, hid it from me. She might think something was a damage that I didn't. It's a very interesting thing. And usually landlords get references on renters and tenants. Tenants don't get references on landlords, but of course they could, because if it was a tendency for landlords to always take the deposit and say, well, you scratched this, you did that.
Yeah, you could probably make it stick, and the transactions cost of suing to recover it are too high.
So there has to be a sort of expected level of damage that's considered, quote, okay.
Uh-huh.
And a related example, we've talked about this before, I think, on the program, is when you sell a house, what condition do you leave it in for the next person?
Yeah.
Some things are considered okay. Some things are considered gauche, but nobody specifies that. There's probably some kind of boilerplate in the contract in a clean and reliable condition, or as it was when blah, blah, blah. I'm sure there's some legalese that if you wanted to sue, you could try, but it's so unpleasant to sue that the way that problem generally gets solved is through the norm of you don't leave garbage strewn about, you don't leave your stuff there, and say, well, you can keep it or not. I'm doing you a favor.
But you'll never see the person again.
You'll never see it. There's
no repeated
dealing. No repeated dealing.
Yeah.
But
most of us do.
But as you say, a culture works well when those norms are both, they emerge and then they're passed on to children and to neighbors in a very informal way.
Well, and social scientists call it a non-specific reciprocity, which seems like a contradiction. But it means that I expect other people to treat me that way. So it's not you and I have a specific long-term relationship. But I, as a member of this culture, I'm going to clean my apartment before I move out. And if I own an apartment, I expect the person to clean it. And by and large, people do it. It's obviously true that doesn't always happen. But by and large, there's this non-specific reciprocity where I think, since other people are doing it, I should do it also, and I do.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing. Do you have anything else you want to talk about?
Well, it's a shame always to...
I have two other points.
Well, I'll be very brief.
Be as long as you want.
We should always talk about baseball. And
can't talk enough about
there was a very important use of a cultural shibboleth as an identification, because a shibboleth is also it's almost a code, a password.
Yeah, that's what it's come to mean. It doesn't mean a word you can't pronounce. It means a password.
Yeah.
It means swordfish, for those of you who are password fans. It's a Marx Brothers reference.
I see.
I'm not going to put the link in. You got to find it.
That's just fine. So
I think it's horse feathers if you're checking.
Now we have the link.
Yeah.
World War II, Battle of the Bulge. There was a Waffen SS, a special weapons SS division that was going up north through St. Vith and then Malmedy. And they'd made considerable progress. They sent ahead some scouts who spoke perfect English, who'd been raised in the United States. And their English was idiomatic, unaccented English, American English. And they sent them ahead wearing American uniforms to just try to blow up things, change the signs on crossroads, and make it more difficult for reinforcements to be brought forward. So they're operating 50, 75 miles behind the lines to try to make it more difficult to bring up reinforcements. And the Americans discovered this, and the question is, how do you identify this person? Because their English was perfect. And of course, the answer was, you hold them at gunpoint, and you say, who led the American League in home runs in 1941?
Yeah.
And it turned out that it actually worked almost perfectly. Now,
almost perfectly. Yeah, they shot a couple
people. There's some type 2 error. They didn't shoot them. All they did was imprison them. So they did. The net was cast a little too widely, admittedly, but it caught almost all of the Germans who had been back. They'd been raised there, but they'd been back in Germany for years. So baseball is literally the American shibboleth in the sense that it was used as a password around Malmedy and St. Vith.
And of course, there's a temptation to say, well, they could have just learned that was unlike the biblical example where they physically couldn't mimic the right answer. You could, if word could get back to the Germans, the German spies, you could say, well, it was... you
could study for a few minutes.
Who was it, by the way, in 1941? I don't know. We'll have to look that up, too. But you could tell them who it was. But, of course, even if you got the right answer...
It was Ted Williams.
Yeah,
that was before he...
before the war.
Yeah.
I mean, it was before he played in 41. But if the person knew it was taught, it was Ted Williams. So they'd say Ted Williams and say... Well, then they'd ask if there was a little suspicion. They might say, "Well, again, and what did he hit?" Well, he hit 406 actually, but you'd never get the answer to the second question. You could always press the cultural questions farther and further, and uncover them.
Well, that was that was the. I'm waiting for your point.
Well, that's a great story. I was going to just mention two things. One is, one thing. One is you talked about how cultural norms are inherited from your parents. This one, I find it hard to believe because it's so ingrained in us. But I read in a wonderful book on music that I forget the name of right now, and I'll put it up when I find it. A wonderful book on music that major and minor keys in music. A major key would be a song like Happy Birthday, and a minor key would be something like, give me a minor key song. A Mournful Dirge is in a minor key.
Uh-huh.
In America, in a Western culture generally, major keys mean happy and minor keys mean sad and mournful. But in other cultures, it's the opposite. They get happy over things that we would hear as sad, and they get sad over things that we would hear as happy. And of course, that has to be taught. But I would have,
it's inherited from who raised you.
Yeah, but I would have thought that would be hardwired.
Yeah, that's astonishing.
Isn't that? It could be true. It could be false.
Well,
that's how astonishing it is. But it was said to be true, and I trust the author.
Let's pose it as a question then. Is it true that sort of the same key and cadence are perceived universally as being sad or happy? And I have no idea what the answer is. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I find it. I found that again hard to believe, but really quite fascinating that was cultural.
Yeah,
because to our ear. You can sad music can make you cry. And the idea that without words, right? Very powerful sad music can make you cry. How could it be that could be cultural and not hardwired in the brain? And of course, many, many, many things about music are hardwired in the brain and are really it's an extraordinary.
Well, once you start to think of it, though, the difference becomes kind of slippery because it's. A lot of things that you just think, well, that has to be universal, aren't.
For sure. Any closing thoughts?
Well, it was Ted Williams. He had led the league with 37 and had, in 1941, a slugging average of .735.
It's a good year.
On-base percentage of .551. That is, as you said, though, the year that he batted .406. And
I think that was the highest on-base percentage of all time before Barry Bonds.
Yeah.
He had a really good year. He did not win the MVP that year, though.
No, because one voter left him off completely.
Was it that year? Was it the year?
I believe that he certainly did not win the MVP that year.
Was it because
I don't know if that was the year that he got left off, but how could he not? If you look,
well, the answer is I think that's the year DiMaggio hit in 56 straight games.
You're right. It was, but still, Ted Williams led the league in base on balls, batting average, home runs, on base percentage, runs, and slugging average.
Yeah.
So it is true that Joe DiMaggio had 348 total bases that year, which is remarkable.
But his 56-game hitting streak, which many people think will never be broken, which of course is not true, but it will be broken someday if we live long enough, if baseball's long enough. But interestingly, in that 56-game hitting streak, during that time, Ted Williams had a higher batting average. He just had a few games where he got a zero. So
but he also went 3 for 4.
Yeah, too many other times to.
Well, it's the baseball is for me not just a shibboleth, but also a religious experience. So I'm happy to close with that.
Yeah, me too. Baseball is a beautiful game. My guest today has been Mike Munger. Mike, as always, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
It was great. Let's talk soon.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.